This video is sponsored by Hearts of Iron 4, Arms Against Tyranny. Check it out via the link in the description. Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim was born the son of Finnish aristocracy on June 4, 1867. Like most of Finland's nobility, Mannerheim was not ethnically Finnish, but a Swede. He spoke Swedish as his first language. And, in spite of being destined to become the father and multi-time savior of the nation, never learned to speak Finnish well. Mannerheim joined the Finnish Corps of Cadets when he turned 14, but fled across the Russian border after getting caught AWOL. There, he enrolled in the Tsar's Nikolaevsky Cavalry School, where he'd graduate with a commission in 1889. 2 years later, he joined the prestigious Chevalier Guards stationed in the Winter Palace, a posting that put him in almost daily contact with the royal family. At the coronation of the last Tsar, Nicholas II, Mannerheim was stationed in a position of honor at the foot of the stairs leading up to the throne. He would stand there at attention for 4.5 hours. Mannerheim would always remember the ceremony as indescribably magnificent. He was not just some toy soldier, though. Mannerheim served with distinction during the Russo-Japanese War and, 2 years later, led an expedition through Central Asia, from Turkestan to Peking. He would even take a detour to the holy city of Lhasa in Tibet, where he struck up a personal relationship with the Dalai Lama and taught the Bodhisattva how to shoot a handgun. Mannerheim would serve under General Brusilov in the First World War and would emerge from the conflict as a corps commander himself. When the Russian Revolution spread to the army in 1917, Mannerheim was saved from capture and likely execution by the Reds thanks to being stationed in Odessa where he was recovering from a wound. So with Russia falling apart around him, Mannerheim returned to Finland, arriving on December 5th, one day after its parliament voted to declare independence. For the first time in 35 years, Mannerheim was home, and it was in a state of civil war. So you can call me Ezekiel, and this is Finland's Civil War, Winter War, and the Continuation War. But first, I want to tell you that this video couldn't possibly have a more appropriate sponsor, because this video is sponsored by Hearts of Iron 4's newest expansion, Arms Against Tyranny. Pre-order it now via the link in the description. Arms Against Tyranny adds new content for all of our favorite Nordic nations, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and of course, the star of today's video, Finland. In the new Finnish focus tree, you can choose to follow the historic path by planning and leading the nation's defense against Soviet aggression, and then counter-invading alongside the Germans in the Continuation War. Or break from history by following any of the alternate history routes, including pro-Axis and independent right-wing paths, forming an alliance of Scandinavian nations, or even follow the radical left-wing path to refight the Finnish Civil War and put the communists in charge. That's all on top of brand new mechanics, including new national manufacturers and weapon designers to specialize your industries, the new international weapons market, allowing you to become the ANCAP arms dealer of your dreams, and a reworked division designer. Arms Against Tyranny is coming out soon, so this is your last chance to pre-order and unlock the exclusive bonus song. Doing so is a great way to thank Paradox for supporting this channel. Links to where you can pre-order Arms Against Tyranny are in the description. And now, back to the video. Finland first entered the European system after its conquest by Sweden in the Middle Ages. As medieval Sweden grew into the modern empire, Finland provided some of its best auxiliary troops. This lasted until Sweden's defeat by Russia in the Finnish War of 1808, which saw Finland transferred to Russia as an autonomous duchy. Russian Finland was largely left to its own devices until the 19th century, allowing it to experience rapid industrialization and population growth. But by the turn of that century, the Russians began to chip away at their autonomy. In spite of the tensions that this created, the revolution of 1905 was not nearly as violent in Finland as it was in the rest of the empire, and order was quickly restored in Finland. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was a different story, though. While Finland was a part of the Russian Empire during the First World War, many Finns volunteered to fight for the Central Powers. Several thousand Finns would join Germany's elite 27th Prussian Jaeger Battalion, which fought on both eastern and western fronts of the war. Veterans of the 27th would play an essential role in all of Finland's coming conflicts. According to historian William R. Trotter, almost every successful Finnish field commander in both the Civil War and Winter War received his basic training in the 27th Jaegers. Veterans of that unit became, for all practical purposes, an elite professional caste. Finland's national-level response to the Russian Revolution was to elect a Soviet parliament that then voted to assert the nation's autonomy. This outraged the conservatives, who resigned in protest. But when the socialists lost their majority in the October Revolution, they radicalized too, and decided to follow in the Bolsheviks' footsteps by initiating a revolution to retake control of Finland by force. Amidst the ensuing radicalization and growth of red and white militias, Finland declared its independence from Russia on December 4th. By January 29, 1918, the crisis came to a head. Members of the now revolutionary Social Democratic Party formed a new government, the Finnish Socialist Workers' Republic, also known as Red Finland, and took control of the major cities and nearly all of southern Finland, including the capital at Helsinki. But both the countryside and several key cities remained in white hands. A split like that could only mean one thing: civil war. The Reds began the Civil War with a marked advantage over the Whites. In addition to controlling the most valuable parts of Finland, the Red Guard were both numerically and materially superior to the Whites, outnumbering them 40,000 to 25,000. The Reds also enjoyed the tacit support of the 70,000 Russian troops still stationed in the country. However, a combination of Mannerheim's leadership and the return of the veterans of the 27th Jaegers were more than able to make up for this. Mannerheim was appointed commander-in-chief of the White forces shortly after his arrival. One of his first moves was to march his army to Vasa, where 40,000 Russians were garrisoned. There, the Whites played a trick by placing their best-equipped soldiers at the front of the column. This made it look to the Russian garrison like the whole White army was well-equipped and dangerous, so to avoid a deadly confrontation over a conflict they didn't really care that much about, the garrison surrendered. This one move removed 40,000 potential Reds from Finland and secured the weapons and supplies the White Army needed to prosecute the war. On January 31st, the Reds began their first and only major offensive of the war targeting Vilppula, but it failed to make any meaningful progress. This allowed the Whites to seize the initiative with their own offensive towards Tampere, the third most populous city in Finland. This offensive was way more successful, surrounding the city and 15,000 Red Guards inside. Initial attempts to storm the city were unsuccessful though, but after being reinforced by men from the 27th Jaegers, it was taken on April 6th. However, Finland's fate would not be decided by the Red or White armies. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which established peace between Germany and the Soviet Union, put Finland firmly within the German sphere of influence. The Germans intended to collect on that. On February 14th, the Finnish Whites were pressured into asking the German government for its assistance in the Civil War. Tens of thousands of German troops were promptly landed on the south coast and captured Helsinki from the Reds in just a couple of days. The Germans then joined the White Army in chasing down the last significant Red resistance to Viborg, whose fall convinced the remaining communist forces to surrender in early May. The last Red-held position at Fort Eno would be captured on May 15, 1918. The following day, Mannerheim led his troops in a triumphant parade through the capital. Like most other revolutionary conflicts, both the Red and White forces committed atrocities known as Red and White terrors against enemy combatants, prisoners, and civilians. As the war's victor, the Whites were able to inflict their terror on more people and for longer. Executions were the norm, and were usually only stopped due to a lack of ammunition. At least 10,000 prisoners would survive and be kept in camps where they suffered from appalling conditions, and high mortality rates as a result. By the war's end, the Red Terror would claim roughly 2,000 lives, while the Whites killed at least 10,000. The total death toll for the Civil War was roughly 35,000 people, which was over 1% of Finland's population. The victorious Germans declared Finland a protectorate and appointed a new pro-German government there. Mannerheim was not to last in the new administration. He wanted to pursue the Reds into Russia, take East Karelia for Finland, and possibly even Petrograd. But the Germans negotiated a very favorable treaty with the Soviets, so didn't want to let their Finnish subjects sabotage it. Mannerheim resigned in protest. On October of 1918, the Finnish parliament was pressured into placing Kaiser Wilhelm's brother-in-law, Frederick Charles of Hesse, on the Finnish throne. But this king-in-waiting wouldn't even set foot in Finland. The World War had turned against the Central Powers, resulting in Germany's political collapse. The Kaiser was forced to abdicate, and Germany was declared a republic. Mannerheim quickly met with the war's victors, Britain and France, to salvage Finland's position. They agreed to protect Finland if it broke itself off from Germany. Thus, German troops were forced to leave the country, and Mannerheim became the nation's regent until a new government could be created. So leave a dashing away emoji in the comments to commemorate what will soon only turn out to have been the first time the Finns had to forcibly eject once allied German troops from their country. After the Germans left, the Finnish people voted for their new form of government. Options included a monarchy or a constitution with either a strong or weak presidency. The Social Democrats, the party most associated with the failed Red government, were allowed to participate in these elections and advocated for the last option. Remarkably, those Social Democrats and their allies won the vote by a huge margin. So in spite of having just fought a civil war to keep the Social Democrats out of power, the Finnish people voted them right back into it. Much of this can be attributed to the Social Democrats making clear during their campaign that they no longer supported revolution. Even more remarkably, Mannerheim then failed to win the first presidential election, even though most people considered him to be a shoo-in candidate. And so, in the ruins of its civil war, the modern state of Finland was born. Relations between Finland and the Soviet Union almost started out warmly. The two countries signed the Treaty of Tartu in 1920, establishing their mutual borders. But conflict arose shortly after when separatists rose up in Russian East Karelia. Up to 2,000 Finns crossed the border to fight for the rebels, something which the Soviets were not happy about. In Karelia, the Finnish Civil War played out again in miniature, as many of the Soviet troops were Red Finns who fled across the border. The Karelian uprising would end in failure by March of 1922, prompting up to 30,000 East Karelians to flee to Finland. Things would only get worse from there. On August 23rd, 1939, German and Soviet diplomats met to discuss what will become the non-aggression and trade agreement known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This pact included a secret protocol establishing spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. Nearly all of the Baltic region went to Russia, and that included Finland. Finland could only watch as the Russians occupied their share of the East European states one by one. Then, on October 5th, it was their turn. The Finns were invited to talks where the Russians laid out their demands. Russia's primary interest in Finland was not of total conquest, but of a border adjustment to move Finland away from the city of Petrograd, which the Russians believed to be dangerously exposed to Finland. This border adjustment involved the transfer of a significant part of the Karelian Isthmus to Russia, moving the border to within 20 miles of the major Finnish city of Viipuri. The Soviets also demanded the dismantling of all fortifications on the Isthmus and the handover of some and leasing of other islands in the Baltic. In compensation, the Finns would be given 5,500 square kilometers in East Karelia. This was not the first time the Russians had asked for something similar to this. They had made less forceful demands for a similar border adjustment back in April of 1938. There were even those in the Finnish government who believed they should have given in to those relatively modest Soviet demands to avoid a future war. Mannerheim was amongst them. But they didn't get their way, as at the time the Finns were able to play the Germans and Russians off of each other. But now, with the Russian Molotov Pact precluding German intervention, the Finns were vulnerable. The Finnish government believed that this was only the beginning of Soviet demands, so to give in and destroy their fortifications now would leave them unable to resist future demands. Negotiations dragged out until November 3rd, when the Russians got so frustrated by Finnish recalcitrance that their chief negotiator, Molotov, whose name makes up half of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, snapped. Since we civilians don't seem to be making any progress, perhaps it's the soldiers' turn to speak. It was only after the negotiations fell apart that the Finnish government thought to ask Mannerheim what their prospects were in case of a war. He told them the same thing he told them back in 1938, that the Russians were not bluffing, that their demands were serious, and that the Red Army was a formidable enemy. Finland's military, he explained, was critically deficient in weapons and ammo, while its air force was tiny and obsolete. He said that Finland's only real military asset was delusionally high morale among the soldiers. The politicians thought that Mannerheim was just afraid of the Russian army, most unbecoming of a proper Finn. He was technically Swedish after all, so they ignored him. When the war came, Mannerheim would be proven right about every point except for one. On November 26th, 7 artillery shells landed 800 meters inside of Soviet territory. The Soviet government sent a furious note accusing the Finns of having fired them, holding them responsible for the supposed deaths of 4 and wounding of 9 Russian troops. This accusation was absurd for many reasons, not least of which being that every Finnish gun had been ordered deep inside of Finland so it would be impossible to fire into Soviet territory. It is almost certain that the Soviets fired those shots themselves. Helsinki protested its innocence, citing the attack's very impossibility as proof. But the Soviets gave them no response. Instead, the Kremlin issued a public note stating that their forces were under attack across the Soviet-Finnish border, that this was the exclusive fault of the Finnish government, that normal relations were to be ended, and that Finnish representatives were to be recalled. In essence, a declaration of war. A few hours later, Helsinki was bombed. Finland was now at war. In the days leading up to the war, Mannerheim declared that the Finnish army was in such a poor state that he could no longer accept responsibility for the defense of Finland. He appealed desperately to his government to reopen negotiations, and after that failed, tried to resign on November 27th. But instead, right after the bombs fell on the capital, he was made commander-in-chief. Mannerheim's assessment of the Finnish army proved to be totally accurate. It didn't have so much as a single tank, lacked anti-air and anti-air weapons, and was critically low on all types of ammunition. And, while morale was high, the troops were terrified of Soviet tanks. However, both sides massively overestimated the capabilities of the Red Army. While it is true that the Russians enjoyed a marked advantage in manpower and material, including armor, artillery, and ammunition, it suffered from fundamental problems. Finland was not conducive to large army formations, and the quality of Russian troops was mixed. Their tactics and leadership were even worse. Russian commanders were trapped in a highly regimented command structure, restricting their tactics to very little other than mass frontal assaults. The Russian forces also made no proper preparations for winter fighting, failing to so much as paint their vehicles white. At the very least, the Soviets attacked during a favorable season, and they had built up infrastructure along the Finnish border to relieve some of the logistical challenges. However, the good weather would only last them a few weeks. Failure to defeat the Finns quickly would allow the subarctic winter to set in, putting a halt to military operations. All of this is before considering the massive advantages the terrain gave to Finland. They were far more comfortable in the subarctic conditions than the Russians, and knew the local terrain. The Finns had even mapped out and pre-ranged every likely target of artillery in advance. So while Finland's limited ammo made it impossible to do things like saturation bombardments, they were at least able to make their limited ammunition count. The bulk of the fighting would take place on the Karelian Isthmus, guarded by the Mannereim Line, Finland's most powerful defensive construction, though it was nothing like France's Maginot Line to which it is often compared. The Mannerheim Line was mostly a network of trenches punctuated by concrete bunkers. While not particularly impressive in itself, when combined with the difficult terrain, subarctic conditions, and a garrison of determined troops, it was a formidable obstacle. In preparation for the invasion, civilians were removed from the approaches, and their housing and infrastructure were destroyed and replaced by barbed wire and tank traps. Incredibly, it was discovered after the war that Soviet intelligence had accurate maps of Finland's defenses the whole time, but no one actually bothered getting it to the troops. Going into the war, there was a joke being told among the Finnish troops. They are so many, and our country is so small. Where will we find the room to bury all of them? As bombs fell on Helsinki and other major cities across Finland, the Finnish government changed hands from anti-Soviet hardliners to more conciliatory leadership whose #1 priority was opening negotiations with the Russians. They also did everything they could to secure foreign support for the war effort. The main Soviet attack on the Karelian Isthmus was carried out by over 100,000 men and 1,000 tanks. Finnish operational security was quickly breached, as the Russians were able to tap into their communications and sow confusion with false messages. But the Russian columns advanced with absurd caution. Even light small arms fire would be enough to halt an advance for hours. When the Soviets finally found the actual Finnish positions, they failed to coordinate their artillery, airstrikes, armor, and human waves. The only Soviet assets proving to be effective were their tanks, whose presence alone was enough to rout Finnish troops. But it didn't take long for the Finns to get over their fear, and to develop weapons and tactics to handle them. The primary method the Finns used to fight tanks was to simply ignore them and focus fire on their infantry support. When the infantry was wiped out, the tanks would either have to retreat or face destruction at the hands of rushing Finns armed with anything from Molotov cocktails to logs and crowbars intended for jamming in the tanks' wheels. When the Soviets finally reached the Mannerheim Line, they began to suffer truly atrocious casualties. The fiercest fighting was on the Finnish left, abutting Lake Ladoga. Here, the worst of bad tactics, improper equipment, and well-prepared Finnish defenses caused the Russians to suffer extreme casualties for hardly any gain. It was not uncommon for single Russian attacks to result in over 1,000 deaths, the loss of dozens of tanks, and no progress. Some Finnish machine gunners even had to be removed from the front due to the psychological stress of killing so many people so easily. By late December, much of the Russian armor had been destroyed and their supplies consumed, causing the offensive to falter. This seemingly miraculous curbing of the Red Army sent Finnish commanders, including Mannerheim, into a state of euphoria, one so delusional that it convinced them to launch a counteroffensive. The plan was to attack and surround a Soviet salient to destroy the 3 divisions inside. Among the many, many problems with this plan was that, as battered as the Russians were, the Finnish army was in an even worse position. Food was unreliable for everyone, and many units lacked water. They couldn't eat the snow either because it had been contaminated from Russian shelling. All of the men were exhausted from the fighting, and without many reserves, those same spent troops would have to be the ones to carry out the offensive. Moreover, the only reason why the Finns were able to perform so well is that their entire military was trained and preparing for this style of defensive warfare and no other. The army was downright amateurish when it came to the kinds of conventional offensives their leadership was asking of them. And, just as the Finns were weak on the offensive, the Russians were tenacious defenders. To cap it all off, right before the offensive, a blizzard hit the area. Needless to say, on December 23rd, after a paltry artillery barrage, the advance of exhausted Finnish troops was quickly halted, and the attack had to be called off. But not before the Finns needlessly suffered 1,300 combat casualties and 200 cases of frostbite. The Mannerheim Line kept the Karelian Isthmus safe, but the rest of Karelia was not nearly as well fortified. Why would it be? It was naturally fortified by dense forests and lacked the infrastructure needed to support large army formations. Who would attack there? While the Finns had anticipated some Soviet offensives in the area, they were taken aback by their scale and ferocity. It turned out that the Soviet plan was to overwhelm Finland with massive attacks from every possible direction, the most important of which was the one north of Lake Ladoga. If successful, the thrust would bypass the Mannerheim Line and cut it off from supply. The attack proved so dangerous that 1/3 of Finland's reserves were sent just to reinforce the one area. The Russians came close to breakthrough at several points, with one not even being stopped by the Finns, but by the hunger of the Russian troops. You see, after a Russian assault broke through the Finnish defenses, they passed through an abandoned Finnish field kitchen. The starving Russians stopped their advance to sate their hunger on the fresh-cooked food. This gave the cooks and other backline troops the time they needed to organize a counterattack, successfully plugging the gap. Reportedly, the old Finnish war cry of Hakapele, dating all the way back to the 30 Years' War, could be heard during some of the close-range fighting that ensued. And that's where we'll leave our plucky Finns, desperately but successfully holding back the overwhelming Soviet invasion. But how much longer can Finland possibly last? What does the international community, embroiled in the early stages of World War II, think of the conflict? And even if Finland survives the war, who could it possibly turn to for an ally to stop a Russian invasion from happening again? Find out all of this and more in Part 2, which, when it's out, you'll be able to watch by clicking the link on the top right of your screen. This video was funded by the Finnish White Guard, as a part of their recruitment campaign to fill the ranks of the White Army and cast the communist menace out of Finland, including their chief recruitment officers G.S. Rogers, Josiah, Peter, and the Union of X, and by this video's sponsor, Hearts of Iron 4, Arms Against Tyranny. This is your last chance to pre-order the expansion and secure the exclusive pre-order music pack. Doing so is a great way to thank Paradox for sponsoring our content. Links to Arms Against Tyranny and where you can support us directly are in the description. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. I'll see you in Part 2.